He is the fullest expression that we have of the Hippocratic theory of physiology and of humors and so on.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to People, Parasites, and Plagues, a podcast aimed at delivering information about the fascinating pathogens among us from the scientists who study them. I am Kim Klonowski.
And I am David Peterson, your host for today's episode. Today's guest has studied a physician whose ideas on health and disease held sway for over 1,000 years.
Our guest today is Dr. Susan Mattern, Distinguished Research Professor in the Department of History at the University of Georgia. Susan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So one of the things we like to ask all our guests is about their path to the chosen career in academia. So how did you end up from a young girl growing up, well, you can start with where, and end up at UGA?
I grew up in California, and I went to University of California at Berkeley, and that's where I got interested in ancient history because I had a professor there who was a very, very famous Roman historian named Eric Gruen. And I just loved his classes. And I was young. I didn't really have the kind of sense of direction that my kids have and that young people kind of have today. But he was very encouraging and helped me get into graduate school. I went to Yale for graduate school. And Ramsay MacMullen, who recently died, is very, very famous, wonderful Roman historian. So I don't really have a good story about how I came to be a history professor or an ancient history professor. And I don't really have a great story of how I came to write about Galen, but my first book was about Roman imperialism, and I read a lot of historians, Tacitus, Livy, all of that, and I got a little bit bored reading those sources, and I audited a seminar on a topic in Greek culture in the Roman period, and we read some Galen, and I thought it was just so much fun that I decided to write about Galen, and if I'd thought about it a little more, I might not have done it because it took a really long time to read his corpus. Yeah, but I didn't set out to be a professor or anything. I didn't have a plan.
Well, I mean, I like that because sometimes, right, it is interesting that,
Yeah.
your experience guides what happens to you,
Yeah.
right? So the question that I have is why Roman history? Were there other periods in history that you were interested in, or was it simply the mentor in the...
I liked a lot of different. I was a history major. I remember really liking Russian history, and I honestly can't remember why I chose Roman history and ancient history. And it was hard. I had to learn a bunch of languages. I had to learn Latin. So I was very motivated somehow. I had to learn ancient Greek, which was very, very difficult. I think that once I got into the Latin class, I had Latin over the summer. Berkeley has a well-known summer Latin program, very intensive program. And I met so many wonderful people in that program. A lot of them were doing Renaissance, but that really, I think, was part of the reason I continued on that path because I had good friends who were also doing it.
So I know we're here today to talk about your research on Galen, but what are your research interests kind of overall?
I guess my research interests have kind of evolved. I'm a little bit, I guess now we call it ADHD, but I find almost everything interesting in one way or another, and I get a little bored when I have to do the same thing for too long. So for example, I like teaching world history, and I've designed a few courses that are really, really broad in scope at graduate level and undergraduate level. I'm teaching history of disease next semester. I think it's full, but there may be a couple slots left if somebody wants to be in there. And that goes from, we're going to start in antiquity. I haven't really decided. I have to rewrite it for this year, but we start in antiquity and go all the way through. The last thing we learn about is the AIDS epidemic. So
Hypothetically speaking, if a faculty member snuck into the back of the room for every
it would
lecture,
static. I love my non-traditional students.
I was just going to go there, right? What kind of disguise can we wear?
That would be amazing. I love my non-traditional students. I love my medical school students, and once in a while I get a doctor in that class, and it's amazing. So that's really a world history class where I try to hit as many continents as possible, and I have to learn a lot to teach a class like that. And my most recent book is a world history of menopause.
it sounds very challenging to teach a class on world history of
It's
cities.
it's very challenging. You have to make a lot of tough decisions, as you can probably imagine, and I think that I'm not as good as I could be about bringing it all together around, a set of interconnecting themes. I'm gonna try and do a little better job with that this year, but any way you slice it, it's a learning experience for everybody, and
Mhm.
I feel like my classes where I'm also learning a lot go the best, just that excitement of exploring and learning new things that I get to share with my students makes the class special.
Yeah, that's really exciting. So, one of the reasons why we were interested in having Susan here today is because she's written a book on Galen. So, the obvious question I think to start with is, who was Galen? Can you tell us a little bit about his background?
Sure. Yeah. Galen lived in the 100s CE. So he was born around 129 and he lived in a part of what's now Turkey. So he was born in the what's now the city of Bergama in Turkey and was the Greek city of Pergamon. So it was one of the most important Greek cities in the ancient Mediterranean world. So after Alexander conquered the Persian Empire in the 320s BCE, he and his successors founded Greek cities all over the ancient Near East, and the elites of those cities and of those regions became a Greek-speaking elite. So that's the world that Galen was born into. And at the time, Pergamum was the capital of the Roman province of Asia. So the Romans had inherited, literally, Attalus III left the Romans the kingdom of Pergamum in his will when he died. And so Asia was a Roman province, and Pergamum was the capital of that province. And so he was born in the Roman Empire, but he was born in a Greek city that was part of the Roman Empire, and he was an ethnic Greek, and Greek is the language that he wrote in. So when he was growing up, when he was a teenager, he thought he was going to study philosophy, as a lot of the sort of upper class, the ruling class of the Greek cities did. But his father had a dream that Galen should study medicine instead. And so Galen went on to study medicine with the best teachers that his father could find for him.
Well, that really brings us to another question we had was at that time, I'm assuming they did not have established medical schools. So how does
Not
one learn medicine and be recognized as knowledgeable and a healer?
That's a really good question, and I have a chapter in my book on education. So it is the case that there's not the kind of the institution that we think of when we say medical school is not really the kind of thing that existed in antiquity. However, there were things more or less called schools. School is a decent translation of some of the words that the Greeks used to describe what was going on. So what you did have was, so you had a teacher and somebody who was really well known for medicine or philosophy or for being a certain kind of, in a certain kind of tradition of medicine or philosophy or whatever. And then you studied with that teacher, and people from elite families would travel long distances to study with some of these teachers, whether they were medicine doctors or philosophers or sometimes jurists, as a kind of lawyer, or certain other kinds of intellectuals also sometimes had these kinds of schools. So Galen studied with physicians who were practicing and teaching in Pergamum. His father found him teachers from Pergamum to teach Galen, and then he had a couple of teachers who were actually from elsewhere, but were practicing in Pergamum at the time and also teaching. And Galen himself also taught as well as practiced. And then Galen left Pergamum after his father died when he was about 19, and he went to the city of Smyrna, which is now Izmir, also in Turkey, and studied with another teacher there. Galen had a certain idea of his place in the medical tradition. So he had heard of, but had never met, this guy named Quintus. And Quintus was also from Pergamum, and he was from about Galen's grandfather's generation. So he was already dead by the time that Galen started to practice medicine, but Quintus had left Pergamum and gone to Rome and become a Roman citizen, and we know that because he used his Roman first name, Quintus. And all of Galen's teachers were Quintus's students. Well, not all of them right at the beginning, but Galen sought out Quintus's students to teach him because I think that he wanted to be like the next Quintus. That's my theory. So, and he says this several times, that he traveled wherever he could find one of Quintus's students. And his teacher Satyrus at Pergamum was one of Quintus's students. And his teacher Pelops at Smyrna was the student of one of Quintus's students. And he continued to seek out people who had studied with Quintus. So he saw himself, even though he says many times, I'm not a part of a sect, I'm not an empiricist, he definitely saw himself as a third generation disciple of Quintus, as somebody in the school of Quintus, as a successor of Quintus, really. Quintus's teacher was this guy named Marinus, who had written what was then the sort of equivalent of the graduate level textbook on anatomy. So he'd written this comprehensive book on anatomy that was the most sophisticated thing that was available at the time. And that's been lost. We don't have Marinus's work. But Galen, I think from an early age, he wanted to write the next to be the next Marinus and write the next anatomy textbook. So he was following in the tradition of Marinus and Quintus, and that's how he saw his education. So even though he didn't go to medical school in the way that we think of it, he did have all of that. Now, he did spend several years studying at Alexandria, which is the city in Egypt that was founded by Alexander himself in 331 BCE, and became a real intellectual capital of the ancient Greek world. And it was especially famous for the study of medicine. So there was a large concentration of this kind of person who taught medicine to elites in Alexandria, and Galen studied there for some time. And it was especially famous for anatomy because in the 300s BCE and the early 200s BCE, there were a couple of guys there who actually dissected human beings, which was not by and large practiced in antiquity. But there was this window of exception in Alexandria in the early 3rd century BCE. And so Alexandria had this reputation for being a place where you could study anatomy and you could see real human skeletons and things like that.
So how did students pay for their medical education? Did their parents or them actually have to pay, or were they like apprentices, so they kind of worked it off?
For the most part, they were from wealthy families who had income from mostly farming. So Galen's family, we know, had owned land, and Galen's father even retired to live on some of his rural property before he died. So typically, elite families, their basis of their income was land. They either rented it out or they sold the produce or both. So Galen didn't really have to worry about making a living or having an income. And it's not even clear that he ever charged his patients. He says that he did not charge patients. Now, whether physicians charged to teach students, probably most of them did, but there's not really a lot of evidence. I know that sophists, which were another kind of professor who taught rhetoric, did charge students, and we even have some comments on the kind of pay structures that they used. And most of these doctors probably did charge to teach their students, but some of them might not have. But to the extent that they did charge and Galen had to pay, and he also had to pay to live independently while he was studying medicine, that income came from the property that his family owned.
So, Susan, Galen influenced many medical fields at the time, and perhaps anatomy and pathology the most. He was a proponent of the theory of the four humors. Can you tell our listeners who may not know about the four humors what they are?
Sure. Galen did not invent the theory of the four humors, but he was its main proponent who survives. So Most of the ancient medical tradition has been lost, but a lot of Galen's work survives, and he happened to be a champion of the four humors theory. It wasn't the only theory around at the time. Its main rival was an atomist theory. The theory of the four humors is really well attested. It's in Aristotle, it's in the Hippocratic corpus. So by Galen's time, it's really long traditional in medicine to imagine the body as composed of fluids or humors. So Hippocratic corpus is the earliest body of medical texts in Greek, and mostly written in the 5th century and the 4th centuries BCE, so a long time ago by the time that Galen's writing. But he thought of the Hippocratic corpus as the foundation of medical knowledge. And part of his intellectual stance was the idea that Hippocrates is always right and everybody else is basically wrong except for him. And in the Hippocratic corpus, there's definitely this concept, and sometimes it's explicit and sometimes it's not, but this idea that the body is made up of fluids, and the fluids we hear most about are bile and phlegm and blood, of course. And then in some treatises, there's this concept of black bile, especially in the one called The Nature of Man, which is the one that really, that's the Hippocratic treatise that really talks about the four humors and gives us the idea that there are four humors and they match the four seasons, and they have the four qualities of hot, wet and dry, and hot and cold, and they have, they each have a specific mixture of those things. And so that is the sort of systematic exposition of the four humors theory in the Hippocratic corpus, and Galen really expands on that quite a bit. So by his time, this was sort of the mainstream consensus view of medicine, but there was a rival view that this sect called the Methodists. Galen hated the Methodists, and most of what we know about them comes from him. So we have a little bit of a warped view of Methodists. But Methodists did not accept the theory. So the four humors theory partly reflects the tradition of the four elements. So starting with Empedocles in the 5th century BCE, there's the notion that all of the world is made up of earth, fire, air, and water. And this, in some ways, it's a little bit loose, like nobody's directly making these connections, but it's clear that the four humors theory is related to four elements theory, and the qualities of the elements are the same as the qualities of the humors, that is hot, dry, cold, and wet. The Methodists accepted a different theory of physics, which was Democritus's theory of atoms, and that everything is made of atoms and void. And so they had a really different idea of how the body was composed and of causes and disease, and so on. It didn't always affect as much as you would think, but it was a rival theory, and it was really popular in Galen's time. However, he hated the Methodists and devoted his life to trying to destroy that, to destroy them, to destroy their sect. And he was successful because his writings survive, and we don't know really that much about the Methodists.
So this brings up the question, how much of Galen's writings still exist? And also, are there any, and I probably know the answer to this, but are there any of the original writings of his on original
Oh, interesting. Oh, great
scrolls?
question. Yeah, that is a terrific question. So we have about 125 to 150 works of Galen, and they're of really various lengths. Some of them are very short. Some of them are, up to 1,000 pages long or so. So it's a lot for a body of work in ancient Greek. It's really a lot. It's by far the largest corpus of work that we have from antiquity. And we don't have, it's a really good question to ask whether we have the original things written in his own hand. We don't, as a short answer. We do have some, this is a really good question. What is the earliest manuscript that we have? I think we have some fragments on papyrus, which would probably be from the 2nd or 3rd century CE. So sometimes we dig up scraps of copies of books that have been preserved in basically garbage heaps in ancient Egypt. People threw them out, and we excavate them, and lots of these scraps of ancient paper, papyrus, survive, and a fraction of those have been opened up and read and transcribed. And I think there are a few fragments of Galen's works on that, but we don't have whatever he wrote or had more commonly had written. He had a large number of slaves, and some of them were stenographers, and some of them wrote He talks about this. Some of them wrote in nice bookhand, and probably most of what he wrote was actually written by his slaves. He would dictate to them and they would write. But we don't have any of those things. Those all perished. Galen kept all of his works. He kept copies of all of his works. He had like the equivalent of remote backup storage. He was really worried about losing his books. He donated copies to his home library at Pergamum. He shipped them all the way over there, and he kept copies in his country estate in Campania. And he kept the copies that he had at Rome, his most precious books that he had at Rome, he kept in a storage facility that was supposed to be fireproof near the Temple of Peace in the center of the city. And in 192, really near the end of the year of 192, that whole district burned and his fireproof storage burned. And he lost a lot of stuff, including some things that he had been waiting to transfer to Pergamum, so he lost the originals and the backup copy at the same time. He lost his secret books. So one thing he did not make copies of was his secret book of medical recipes that he had compiled over his whole lifetime, and he had inherited recipes and he traded for other ones. And he did not publish that because they were secret. And so, but he lost that, and that was like one of the losses that he felt the most. So some of his works burned in his own lifetime and were destroyed in his own lifetime.
Secret recipes in medicine.
Yes.
Scary.
All doctors had them. And then Galen, after that, he wrote up most of the pharmacological treatises that we have that he wrote date to after the fire, I think because he had lost all of his materials and he decided, well, screw this, no more secret recipes. I'm going to publish my recipes so that they don't get lost.
So what were Galen's major contributions to the field of medicine?
So Galen, I would say that his main contribution was that his version of the basic Hippocratic theory of medicine is the one that survives. That's one of the main things that he did. He wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote, and he wrote so much that he came to dominate the tradition after him. He is the fullest expression that we have of the Hippocratic theory of physiology and of humors and so on. So he didn't really necessarily invent most of those ideas, and they're very complicated. I'm really, really oversimplifying. When we talk about Galen's theory of respiration, there's so much going on. It would take forever, and you'd be bored to death listening to it. But that whole sort of ancient view of how the body works, he is the fullest expression of that. He also is the fullest expression of the ancient tradition of anatomy and what people in antiquity knew about anatomy. And in that area, he did make some original discoveries about the brain, certain muscles in the face and the eyes, and so on. He was also building on a long tradition of anatomy, of people who had dissected bodies and described what they saw. It's really difficult to just cut something open and see something that makes any sense at all. You have to have a tradition that you're working in. Galen believes strongly that that tradition can't just be books. He believed that those really would not make any sense without live instruction. So they were really manuals for understanding what you're seeing when you're also dissecting with a teacher. But, ironically, then his books were used to sort of reconstruct the state of anatomical knowledge later. And so Galen himself, as I mentioned before, he did not dissect humans. That just wasn't something that was done. He missed an opportunity a little bit that he thought that if he had gone with Marcus Aurelius to the Northern Front, some people who went with Marcus Aurelius, some of his doctors, were allowed to dissect what Galen calls a dead barbarian, one of the enemy. And Galen was just infuriated that he missed that chance because he never got one. He never got a chance to dissect a human. So he doesn't really describe human anatomy, although he tries to, but he's describing the comparative anatomy of different animals. He believed that monkeys were the closest animals to humans, especially their hands. So he dissected a lot of monkeys. He did not know of any great apes or have access to any great apes. The monkey that he dissected most is probably the Barbary macaque. So his human anatomy is probably mostly monkey anatomy, but he also dissected a huge number of other animals. He only says he's never tried to dissect insects.
So during Galen's lifetime, the Roman Empire was hit by a major plague. In fact, it's sometimes referred to as the plague of Galen. Does Galen describe this at all?
Oh, yes. So he doesn't describe the plague itself in as much detail as we would like, but he refers to it a lot. And we do have one case history of that story about a patient who had the plague, but it was a big turning point in his life. So in 168, he was home in Pergamum. He had actually left Rome. He went to Rome, stayed for a few years, and then went back home to Pergamum. But the emperors called him back. He was recalled, and he had to go meet Marcus Aurelius's army in what's now northern Italy. And there, that was the first place he encountered the plague. So this plague had broken out a couple years before in about 166, and Galen and others believed that the army of one of the other emperor, Lucius Verus, who had been fighting the Parthians in the east, that plague came back with the army of Lucius Verus, and they may be right. And so he encountered it for the first time at the military camp in 168 in northern Italy, where a lot of people, as he says, a very, very rough winter, such as he had never experienced before or since. And many, many people died. And he was, had a very rough time trying to treat plague victims in 168. He also tells us that a lot of his household died of the plague, by which he means probably mostly his slaves. Friends died of the plague. And we know from other sources, there are lots of other, that the plague left many records. So not only people mention it in texts, but we can see its effects on the economy, on building programs, and so on. And it seems to have taxes, and it seems to have been really devastating. And it skipped some parts of the empire, as you would expect in a system where, communications aren't what they are today. But it seems to have been really devastating for the parts of the empire that it did afflict, with, hard to estimate what the mortality was, but maybe it might have killed about 25% of people in places that it did affect.
So that's about 100 times higher than SARS-CoV-2.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's not the only event of this kind that we know of. It's not atypical for these sort of pandemics in pre-modern situations to have these kinds of effects. We don't know what it was. I think that the most persuasive case is that it was smallpox. The history of smallpox, as you may know, is fraught. We have sort of competing ideas. So there's a lot of confusion about what exactly is going on with the history of smallpox, and the genetic studies are kind of raising more questions than they answer. There is an argument that smallpox is not as old. It could not be as old as the Roman period, but I sort of don't believe that. I think that this was probably an outbreak of smallpox. And it was a new disease that Galen had not seen before, and may have been the first outbreak of smallpox, at least in the Mediterranean region.
But he himself did not get infected.
He did not. I feel sure that he would have told us if he had had the plague. So I do talk about that a little bit in my book, is why didn't Galen? And I don't have a really good answer for that, other than he dissected so many animals, and he dissected every kind of animal. We know he dissected cattle, and he talks about buying cow heads, beef heads in the market and dissecting the brains. So I think it's possible that he had cowpox, or he had even monkeypox maybe, and so that's why he didn't get the plague.
He was vaccinated.
So I think before we finish today, we should talk about your book, Susan. So your book's titled Galen, the Prince of Medicine. Why did you choose this title?
Well, that's a good question. I am really bad with titles. I really wanted to call it Art is Long. I had dreamed for years of writing a book called Art is Long, A Life of Galen. And that is the Hippocratic aphorism, art is long, life is short. And that's the beginning of a little bit longer aphorism. But that's what I wanted to call it. And the editors didn't like it. And so we went back and forth about a title. And they said, well, do people call him anything? Does he have an epithet or anything? And I said, well, Vesalius called him the Prince of Medicine. And they said, oh, okay, we'll use that. And then when my agent heard about that, he just about had a heart attack. It was the worst. Thought it was a horrible title.
That's very interesting. I kind of like the title.
I love the title too.
Okay, well, that makes me feel better. Yeah.
And because it does kind of place him in the hierarchy of medicine.
Yeah.
And his teachings held sway, as we said in the beginning, for so long.
And this is a title given to him by his biggest critic, Andreas Vesalius, in the early modern period. So in the 16th century. So, even Vesalius is calling him the Prince of Medicine. And I do argue that Vesalius had a little more complicated view of Galen than we think.
And he's the one who disproved the four humors, right? Basically, or kind of came up with the modern.
As Andreas Vesalius, what he mostly did was he was a person very similar to Galen, and I think he knew that he was similar to Galen. Galen's treatises had just become available in Latin translation, and Vesalius read them all, and he realized that Galen had not dissected humans, which Galen is perfectly upfront about, by the way, and he realized that Galen had made a lot of mistakes. So Vesalius was, just a dissection enthusiast and dissected, all kinds of human bodies and had them sitting around in his room, and it was really gross and everything. But he dedicated a lot of his life to correcting Galen's mistakes. And so, yeah. And he wrote the Fabrica, which is the new sort of anatomical textbook.
Well, our guest today has been Dr. Susan Mattern, Distinguished Research Professor in the Department of History. Susan, thanks so much for being with us.
Oh, thank you. This was fun. Thank you.
So links to additional information about Dr. Mattern's research can be found on our Instagram account, which is at PPP Podcast UGA.
As always, we appreciate you tuning in today. And if this is your first time listening to the People, Parasites, and Plagues podcast, we encourage you to check out other exciting episodes launched last season. Please rate the podcast. And if you have any questions or suggestions for future episodes, reach out to us via email at ppp@uga.edu. This podcast is brought to you by the Faculty of Infectious Diseases and the Grady College of Journalism at the University of Georgia. It is supported by the University of Georgia through the Office of Research, the UGA Graduate School, and the College of Veterinary Medicine. Thanks to the New Media Institute at Grady for use of their Studio Not Found podcast facilities, and a special thanks to our production assistant, Sid Wigand, for research, editing, scheduling, and keeping us on track.
That's a wrap.
That's a wrap.